They said Africa had to obey the rules. They said her leaders should take loans, follow orders, and watch their wealth flow quietly into foreign banks. But this week, in the heart of Burkina Faso, a young soldier stood up and broke that cycle. President Ibrahim Traoré, a man born from the dust of struggle, has blocked $10 billion from leaving his nation for Europe. It wasn't a whisper. It was thunder. Markets froze, reporters scrambled, and across the world, in the silent halls of finance, someone whispered, "Did Africa just say, enough?" This is not just about money. It's about the return of dignity, ownership, and memory. For too long, the continent's pulse was controlled by foreign hands. Now one leader dares to reclaim it. In defiance of centuries of economic rule. Stay with me. Because when one nation blocks $10 billion, it's not just a transaction, it's the beginning of a revolution. What kind of man risks everything to challenge a system built to never be broken? Long before the headlines, long before the cameras turned toward Ouagadougou, a quiet war had been raging, not with bullets, but with numbers. For decades, Burkina Faso, like many African nations, lived under a financial spell. Every gold ounce mined from her red soil, every dollar loaned in her name, seemed to travel one direction, outward, to Paris, to Brussels, to banks that wore the mask of partnership but fed on dependence. In the late 1960s and 70s, the dream of economic liberation filled the air. Men like Thomas Sankara once spoke of breaking the chains of debt. But the dream was buried under coups, sanctions, and reforms that came wrapped in aid. By the 2000s, Burkina Faso's budget was written not in Ouagadougou, but in offices thousands of miles away. Then came Ibrahim Traoré, a young officer born long after the colonial flags had fallen, yet still living in their shadow. He rose not from privilege, but from the army ranks, watching farmers struggle as gold companies grew richer. He watched foreign investors extract profit while the nation's reserves shrank, and he asked the question few dared to say aloud. Who truly owns Burkina Faso's wealth? The more he saw, the more the pattern revealed itself. Every year, billions left African shores, dividends, interests, transfers, polished through the legal machinery of capital flow. $10 billion may sound like numbers on a screen, but to the Burkinabe people, it meant roads never built, hospitals never opened, dreams never realized. When Traoré took office, the country's reserves were bleeding. Inflation bit at daily bread. The youth, restless and bright, looked north toward Europe, chasing jobs that did not exist. And behind every crisis loomed the quiet hand of capital flight, money fleeing the very land that birthed it. In confidential meetings, advisors whispered the same warning. "Mr. President, if we try to stop it, markets will punish us." But Traoré, shaped by the memory of Sankara and the voices of soldiers who fought for independence, answered calmly, "Markets have punished us for 50 years. What more can they take?" By early autumn, reports reached the palace that European investment funds were preparing another massive transfer, $10 billion worth of assets moving through layered accounts, ready to be rerouted offshore. That number was more than money. It was sovereignty itself leaving home. He called an emergency council. Ministers argued, economists warned, generals listened. And Traoré stood, his uniform crisp, his tone steady. "We cannot build a future while our wealth escapes each night." The decision was swift, almost surgical. Within 48 hours, a presidential decree froze outbound capital, exceeding a defined threshold. Customs and banks were ordered to report any large transfer to the state treasury. $10 billion, once ready to vanish, was suddenly locked inside the country's borders. The world reacted like a system jolted awake. Trading desks in Europe buzzed with alarm. Investors called it expropriation. Burkina-based citizens called it justice. In the markets of Ouagadougou, vendors spoke his name with pride. Old men nodded, recalling Sankara's brief but blazing era. And in quiet cafes, young people whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, the cycle was finally breaking. Yet beneath the surface, tension brewed. Such defiance never goes unanswered, for when a nation dares to interrupt the river of money, the tide always turns to strike back. Across the continent, rumors began to swirl, that sanctions were being prepared, that embassies were whispering, that Europe was ready to respond. And in the center of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré, calm, resolute, staring into the storm. The question now, would his stand for sovereignty ignite Africa's awakening or its next crisis? The morning after the decree, the world woke up confused. European trading floors flickered with disbelief. Analysts rushed to confirm what seemed impossible. Burkina Faso had frozen $10 billion of outgoing capital. 10 billion, a small nation's roar in a world ruled by giants. In Paris, officials called emergency meetings. In Brussels, ministers whispered about financial instability. And in Washington, the phrase Burkina Faso president began trending, for the first time in decades, not because of crisis or coup, but because of defiance. Reports filled the airwaves. Ibrahim Traoré has halted European withdrawals. Markets on edge as African nation blocks capital flight. Yet inside Burkina Faso, something deeper stirred. On the streets of Ouagadougou, vendors turned up their radios. Students gathered in cafes, watching the president's address replayed again and again. He stood before the nation in his olive uniform, eyes calm, voice deliberate. Our gold is not charity. Our money is not tribute. What belongs to the people must serve the people. The crowd erupted. Old women cried. Young men shouted, "Vive Traoré!" In that moment, the act ceased to be financial. It became spiritual. For every nation that had watched its wealth extracted, that voice felt like redemption. But the celebration was short-lived. Within days, the backlash began. European ambassadors issued formal complaints. International lenders froze pending disbursements. Headlines in major newspapers warned of economic isolation. Television anchors in London asked, "Has Traoré just bankrupted his own country?" But in African social media spaces, another question echoed. Has Africa finally found its backbone? The divide was complete between those who feared collapse and those who tasted liberation for the first time. Behind closed doors, advisors pressed him to reconsider. "Mr. President, the markets are crashing, investors are fleeing, reserves are dropping." Traoré listened silently. Then he asked, "Did they not flee when we obeyed? Did they not starve us when we complied?" He knew the cost of resistance, sanctions, pressure, threats. But he also knew the price of surrender, silence, humiliation, servitude. That night, under the pale light of the palace, he met with his economic council. The room was heavy with uncertainty. Some urged negotiation, others proposed secret channels. Traoré leaned forward, his tone low but unshaken. "If we retreat now, every word we've spoken about sovereignty becomes a lie." Outside, the rumble of protesters grew louder. They were not demanding food or money. They were demanding dignity. For them, the freeze was a symbol. The first time in living memory their government had said no to the powerful and meant it. Yet the machine of retaliation had already started to move. Foreign accounts were frozen. Trade contracts were reviewed. Burkina Faso's currency valuation slipped. Experts predicted collapse within weeks. But something unexpected happened. Ordinary citizens began converting fear into unity. Farmers brought grain to soldiers' camps. Traders offered supplies for free. Students organized voluntary patrols to protect local markets. The nation, so often divided by poverty, was suddenly bound by purpose. Across Africa, talk shows debated whether Traoré's move signaled a continental awakening. Some presidents praised him privately, others distanced themselves publicly. Yet the sentiment spread. If one small nation could block billions, maybe others could demand fair trade, honest contracts, real independence. In the corridors of global finance, panic turned to strategy. A senior banker in Geneva reportedly said, "If Burkina Faso survives this, the system will have to change." And as the dust settled, the young president remained silent, working late nights with his team, preparing emergency stabilization plans. He understood. Symbolism alone would not feed the people. He had drawn the sword of sovereignty. Now, he had to wield it wisely. Rumors spread that sanctions were imminent, aid lines frozen, and covert operations discussed. But inside the palace, Traoré was drafting a new decree, one that could either save his nation or push it beyond the point of no return. The storm had begun. The question was, who would survive the reckoning? The storm did not wait. Within a week of Traoré's decree, the world's financial system began to close in. International transfers were delayed. Development loans were suspended for review. European investors started pulling back from neighboring states, fearing contagion. On paper, the sanctions were technical. In reality, they were punishment. Fuel prices in Burkina Faso climbed overnight. Imports slowed. Bank withdrawals tightened. People who once cheered in the streets now whispered, wondering how long the resistance could last. Foreign media painted grim pictures. Shops closing in Ouagadougou, shortages in essential goods. But what they didn't show was the other side, the quiet resilience that had begun to take root. Communities organized barter systems to replace broken trade lines. Farmers pooled harvests. Families shared food, and street preachers turned frustration into faith. From the pulpits came a single message: "We are poor, but we are no longer owned." Still, the pressure was relentless. Embassies issued travel warnings. Aid agencies warned of economic collapse. In conference rooms in Brussels, men in suits discussed restoring stability, the same phrase that once justified coups and intervention. Meanwhile, Traoré met with his generals, economists, and spiritual leaders. He listened more than he spoke. To the generals, he said, "Our sovereignty is not for sale." To the economists, "Find me a way to survive without the chains of their approval." And to the elders, he asked quietly, "Will the people endure this hardship?" One old man, a veteran from the Sankara era, answered softly, "We have eaten hunger before, but never with pride." Those words struck him like scripture. As weeks passed, the struggle deepened. The Burkina Faso president became both symbol and target. Western media labeled him reckless. African youth called him the new Sankara. The truth lay somewhere between, in the weary eyes of a man who carried both his people's hope and their hunger. Inside the presidential office, late at night, Traoré would walk alone by the maps of trade routes pinned across the wall. Red lines traced the path of capital outflow, money flowing north like rivers drawn against gravity. He touched one line and whispered to himself, "This river must flow back home." Then came a message, discreet, unsigned, but clear. "Lift the freeze and the sanctions will end." It was an invitation to surrender, coded in diplomacy. He set it aside, untouched. Instead, he announced an alternative plan, redirecting the blocked funds toward national development banks, microfinance programs, and domestic production. If the world would not invest in Burkina Faso, the Burkinabe would invest in themselves. The move stunned critics. Instead of collapsing, the economy began to adapt. Small factories reopened, gold refineries expanded, and for the first time in years, local entrepreneurs gained access to capital once locked away in foreign accounts. Yes, there were shortages. Yes, inflation hurt. But pride returned. Not the pride of wealth, but the pride of ownership. Across Africa, the ripple spread. People began to ask, if Traoré can block 10 billion, what could Nigeria do? What could Ghana do? What could we all do together? The question echoed louder than any sanction could silence. But, in the great capitals of the world, the patience of the powerful wore thin. Leaked documents hinted at discussions of intervention. Media outlets subtly shifted the narrative from economics to stability, the old prelude to interference. Inside Burkina Faso, the people stood watch. They had endured hunger before, but now they faced a greater test. Whether faith in sovereignty could withstand the machinery of global finance. One night, intelligence reached the palace. Reports of foreign consultants arriving in a neighboring country, of meetings that spoke of transition plans. Traoré's aides looked at him in alarm. He simply nodded and said, "Let them come. They can take our gold, but not our will." The battle for financial freedom was no longer about money. It was about destiny. When a small nation dares to break a great system, the echo is never contained. Across the Atlantic in Washington, D.C., the mood was cautious, curious, even unsettled. Advisors briefed the administration. The situation in Burkina Faso could destabilize investor confidence across West Africa. Translation: a precedent had been set, and precedents can be dangerous. Television panels in New York debated the issue under the banner, "Is Traoré a freedom fighter or a financial arsonist?" But behind closed doors, many analysts admitted what others would not say aloud, that the Ibrahim Traoré news revealed something deeper than economics. It showed that control, once taken for granted, could now be challenged. Across Europe, the shock gave way to strategy. Diplomats in Paris warned of an alarming nationalist trend. Officials in Brussels floated the idea of new economic partnerships, softer words for the same old control. And in corporate boardrooms, executives murmured, "If Burkina Faso succeeds, others will follow." In Africa, the reaction was split like a continent looking into its own reflection. In Ghana, Mali, and Niger, the streets buzzed with admiration. In Abuja, politicians whispered but avoided cameras. And in the old corridors of ECOWAS, leaders debated whether Traoré was a threat to unity or the embodiment of it. American journalists began connecting dots. The symbolism of a black leader defying global banks resonated deeply with older generations of African Americans. Churches in Atlanta and Chicago invoked his name in Sunday prayers, comparing his courage to that of past revolutionaries who stood against impossible odds. "He's doing what they told every African not to do," one pastor declared. "He's saying no to the empire of money." Meanwhile, global institutions like the IMF and World Bank maintained diplomatic silence, the kind that speaks volumes. They knew this moment was not just about Burkina Faso, it was about the integrity of a financial world order. Behind the scenes, some Western officials pushed for restraint, fearing that open confrontation would turn Traoré into a legend. But legends, once born, are not easily contained. By mid-month, the story had evolved from a headline into a symbol. a fault line in the narrative of who controls the world's wealth. And across Africa, murals began appearing on city walls. A young man in uniform, arms folded, eyes forward, beneath the words, "Africa will rise again." But symbols alone do not feed nations. Even as the world debated his courage, Traoré faced the hardest question of all. After defiance, what comes next? In the weeks that followed, the shouting faded, but the silence grew heavier. The kind of silence that comes after a storm, when everyone is waiting to see what still stands. Burkina Faso had survived the first wave. No collapse, no surrender. The world watched, half in disbelief, half in reluctant respect. Inside the capital, the government quietly began rebuilding the nation's financial architecture, step by step, brick by brick. New trade deals were signed with neighboring countries outside the old colonial web. Gold and cotton exports were redirected to African and Asian partners. Small, local industries were revived through emergency loans funded by the very capital that had once been locked away. Traoré's message was simple. We cannot eat independence speeches. We must build independence with our hands. It wasn't easy. There were shortages, mistakes, setbacks. But for the first time, Burkina Faso's destiny was being written in Ouagadougou, not in Brussels. And across the continent, whispers of imitation began to stir. In markets in Accra and Lagos, traders asked, could our leaders ever do the same? Economists in Nairobi debated the Traoré model. Young Africans online called him the architect of a new era, but Traoré himself was wary of that title. He knew how history treats men who challenge empires. He had seen the portraits of Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah, men who burned brightly, too briefly. Do not worship me, he told a gathering of students. Worship courage, because when I fall, courage must continue. Those words echoed across generations, beyond borders. And even in the West, a quiet reevaluation began. Economists questioning the morality of a system that drains nations while preaching growth. In church pews and think tanks alike, a new phrase began to appear, the Traoré effect. It meant the spark that forces the powerful to remember that the powerless are not voiceless. But this road is long and dangerous. Burkina Faso faces isolation, limited access to credit, and the threat of being economically strangled. Yet for many, the fear of poverty has become less painful than the shame of submission. And so the nation marches on, cautious, wounded, proud. A candle in the storm, flickering but unyielding. And somewhere, in a quiet room, the Burkina Faso president studies a map of Africa. Not as a battlefield, but as a blueprint. Because every revolution begins with one decision, and one man who refuses to bow. History rarely announces itself with trumpets. Sometimes it comes in the quiet voice of a soldier who refuses to obey. In the heart of Africa, that voice now has a name. Ibrahim Traoré, the man who dared to say no to a system older than himself. He did not shout. He acted. He did not beg. He decided. And in doing so, he reopened a question the world thought was closed. Who truly owns Africa's wealth? The story of the Burkina Faso president is not about one man or even one country. It is about a generation tired of watching their future flow into other hands, a generation that believes sovereignty is not a speech, but a sacrifice. As the months pass, global analysts will keep debating the Ibrahim Traoré news, questioning his policies, his risks, his fate. But long after the reports fade, something deeper will remain. The idea that financial freedom is the last frontier of independence. And perhaps when our children read about this moment, they will not remember the numbers or the sanctions. They will remember that once a leader chose dignity over fear, and that choice changed the rhythm of the world. My friends, history is being written not in marble halls, but in red dust and restless hearts. Whether you agree or not, the Ibrahim Traoré news reminds us that courage still exists, that one act of defiance can shake empires. So I ask you, do you believe this is the beginning of Africa's financial awakening, or the last stand of its dreamers? Tell me your thoughts below. And if you believe that voices like this deserve to be heard, like, share, and subscribe. Because the story isn't over. It's only just beginning.